Hello, welcome back, everyone. So we have a number of people not available today. Dan from Google and Young and Brian from Microsoft sent me messages. I have some status from Young and Brian on what's happening with the documentation on CTAM, the CTAM repo. But I think we can talk about that next week when they're available. For this week, we were supposed to have like a presentation for HWI so that we can properly have a discussion about how that stuff is going to be included in the project or how we use it. This is an item for Dan, and I've spoken to him over email, and we're gonna defer this presentation until next week. Other than that, I guess we can do a quick status, and we'll see if there's nothing on the agenda that I see for today other than the HWI thing. So if nothing comes up to discuss today, we may end up sooner. So I see Igor, you wrote something on the status. Thanks for writing that in the doc. If you want to start.
Right. So there is nothing new. I just addressed the comments that you left, and I'm writing like a little article about how to write your own parser for some, tool. It may be useful for other folks if they decide to develop it in a similar way. Because, for example, we have SAT. If we want a Python version of SAT, we can also use this approach. So I want to summarize like methods that you can use to parse text output, and I hope it will be helpful.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the update, Igor. I have unfortunately been overly committed this last period, so I saw your message on Slack about the PR, but I wasn't able to look at it so far. I'm targeting next week.
Okay, thank you. No worries. Take your time.
Okay. Thanks. And for the parsing text output, I think that is actually useful, although generally speaking, in my opinion at least, and others may have different opinions, the usage of the spec output would work best if it is like intrusive to the diag that we're talking about. Like in your case here, there were reasons why we went with a mem tester separate binary, and then you parse the output and all of that, for the stability and the existing versions. But if you think about it, it is somewhat fragile in an interpretation, and it doesn't give you a lot of freedom to like export measurements and stuff very accurately. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Igor. Feel free to.
Yeah. So what do you mean it's hard to export measurements?
So what I'm thinking is, if you're inside a diagnostic binary package, whatever, you would know exactly where and what kind of measurements to export, and you can add additional ones depending on whatever stimulus you add, maybe to the hardware and stuff like that. If you are parsing the output of an existing tool, the only thing that you have available is that output. It's not like you can add stuff easily to more data to be able.
Or you mean like we can modify memtester to make it do some additional things and report these things? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, of course.
And it's a bit more fragile because you have to do all of that text parsing. So if a character changes and all of that, then the parser is broken, right?
Well, this is true, but think about the alternative. If we import code of memtester into the repo and then we insert our spec calls, right, that report things, then you are locked to this particular version anyway. And if you use a specific locked version with text parsing, it is reliable, right? Nothing will change. You're locked to this version. So in fact, I think it has the same stability, but it gives you a little bit more freedom, because theoretically you can switch versions. But with the alternative, you cannot switch versions. You have to like patch a new version with your spec calls, right?
Yeah, that is accurate if you consider that you work with a clone, because in the set case, for example, that Dylan worked on, the whole point of that is the spec output is an enhancement to the set diag that will continue to evolve by its own. Marcus, I'm gonna mute you. So what you're saying makes sense if you say, okay, I picked memtester and it is this particular code base and version of the code base, and there is another memtester upstream which evolves by itself, right? And the point was, we don't want to have this clone fork scenario, because then the code diverges. Ideally, we wanna have like the output as maybe an optional or separate thing, but part of the features of the upstream project without any forks.
Right, but this is the case for SAT, right? As SAT evolves, we cannot just simply include these new changes. We have to do a manual merge, right?
What do you mean by manual merge?
It's like if somebody adds a new feature to SAT and basically they change the source code, then in order to include this change into the diag, you need to merge this change, right? So you have to do some manual work to support new features of SAT. In fact, you are locked to the current version.
No, but SAT is the diag. That's the point. It transforms into the diag package when we say, okay, it has this standard output now, and we qualify this as being the diag.
Right, but this is just our version of SAT. Like normal SAT does not have our diag outputs, right? It has text output.
Depends on what you call normal SAT. The point is this version of SAT would be the reference one that people use.
Okay. But we cannot make our memtester, the reference one, right? Because it's included in the Linux distribution.
Yeah. So that's why I said maybe in this case it is acceptable or a good thing to like do this text parsing thing. But
I see.
ideally, we don't want to do this, right? We want to collaborate with diags or propose new diags that have all of this output as standard, as a feature in the diag, and then it evolves with it. It's not like you have a special fork of the diag that has the output.
Yes, I do understand that. So if we parse a tool that is an existing tool, we should. Sorry, if we use an existing tool, we probably should parse its text, right? But if it's
if we have to.
Right. But if it's some program that we can, take ownership of and include diagnostic compliant reporting, then we don't need to parse it. We just modify it. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. And what I'm saying is that it's, what I'm saying is that it's preferable to be intrusive rather than to add this text parsing on top of something else.
Right. Got it. But it's not the case for memtester, obviously, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is okay as it is right now.
Okay, got it.
All right. Well, I went a bit off on a tangent there, but I think it's important to get this as kind of a guideline, what we just discussed. that if we have diagnostic packages, we want them to evolve as a single code base rather than have separate forks, because obviously those diverge in time. Okay, back to status. Actually, who else is on the call?
Yeah, actually, that point actually is valuable to capture. So so I'm working on trying to get that kind of like a quick start guide, and I think spelling out that decision is important.
Of course,
like
yes.
that directive. So, is there like a 2-sentence or 3-sentence blurb that we can kind of wordsmith it to basic? So, like to summarize exactly what we just said, if you're starting from a new diag development, or you own the diag, modifying the diag to emit the output in the OCP format is what we want. But if you're wrapping an existing tool, it's best to create a wrapper that consumes and parses the output and turns it into OCP diag.
So here's what you are correct, Marcus. Here's what I would do. I can take an action to start a discussion on the main repo, like the core repo, and make up some phrasing on this particular topic, because it kind of needs to go into more details than just this. Like so the cases are, if you have an existing diag, if you want to wrap it, if you own the diag, how you proxy stuff from a different diag that already knows how to output OCP spec. So, you know, the composability thing. So I think all of these are kind of related and should be in the same place. So I'm thinking maybe I can start a discussion with a proposal, and then you and other people can go in there and, like, you know, adapt it or add other opinions.
Okay, yeah, I think because I mean, there's an infinite amount of granularity in use cases, but I think that's why I was thinking, like, just at a very high level, like this is the general case. In my head, I'm envisioning something like, that may be a Google internal thing, but our code style guide, it's do this or that, and then you can expand. It's like, here's the full reasoning, but at a high level, like it's, you know, put the imports in alphabetical order, like, and blah, like, oh, here's, and then you can expand, and it gives you the full, like, verbiage of why, etc. So at a high level, for a quick start guide, this is kind of, here's some guidance, go read in the thing of some more justification for details or something. But I think it's probably good to document what all those are.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I kind of view this as an analogy to settings UI. You want, like, the simple view, and then you click on advanced, and you have, like, the detailed stuff. So we can do all of that. Go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, I think one thing I was going to say is, obviously there's sort of the ideal case where there's a native diagnostic that's being written from scratch and is starting and getting initialized in this structured format. That one is sort of out of the picture. It's an obvious win. It starts this way and it evolves. The question being discussed here is existing tools, existing utilities, and then we have the path of either forking, or we have the path of instrumenting, or augmenting, or wrapping, right? So we have this decision tree. In all cases, I think in the case where we wrap, or we, like Igor is doing with memtester, we should be very clear about the version that we have wrapped or parsed, right? Because that can change. And to that, I was kind of looking back at the fields that we have, and within the diag, and the only one I can very obviously spot that could be used for that, maybe the metadata in the test run start. So maybe the guidance there to Marcos's question is, should we leverage the metadata field to sort of have a guidance to say, you know, capture the version of the tool that is being supported, or at least give information to the users that version, 4.16 is the one that's currently supported. So that's just one thought I wanted to put out here. Go ahead, Adrian.
So I think I have a reply to what you just said. On the PR from Igor, this actually comes up because we have a version field in the run where it says this is the version of the diag. And what I suggested there was that version of the diag should identify with the version of the underlying tool that you're using, in this case, memtester. So you run like memtester once and you see this is the version of memtester, and then you put that into the run. I think what you're asking, though, is more about the compatibility. So what other versions of memtester does this run with? And I don't think that should be in the output. I think that should be in the documentation of the tool, which it is, by the way. It is in the README from Igor.
Yeah, I think you're right, Adrian. I was a bit ahead of myself in rolling it in the diag. I agree with you that at least which platforms and which versions were tested or regress tested with that should be part of the documentation. I agree with you.
Go ahead, George.
Regarding where to record the version in the metadata, would the software info be a logical place for that, or is that more like the software you're trying to test?
Your point is valid, like either way. We don't have a very strict definition of what the software info is there. It can be anything which is relevant to your measurements and to your diag. So in that sense, it could be like tooling that you're using or stuff that exists on the hardware being exercised.
Okay.
There was, I'll add one more thing. There was discussion on how do you self-reference the diag if it is generating some artifacts while it is executing. So this kind of, I feel like this is more closely related to your question just now, which is, do we mention this memtester binary that we're actually using in the software infos?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because my concern about having that version field in the test run, having the underlying binary identify as the diagnostic version. My concern with that would be like in production, it's useful to have the version of the diag itself as like a CL number, a change list number or something, potentially.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I haven't fully thought that through. I'm just thinking out loud.
So I agree with you, and I was thinking the same thing a minute ago after I said that, because technically these aren't coupled. These two versions aren't coupled. Your parser layer, which uses memtester, is technically a different version of software and a code base, if you think about it. So it may actually be a bad idea to identify that version of the run start object with the version of memtester. In which case, I think software infos is like a good place for that. Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking also how this ties to the GitHub discussion on skipping tests, vaguely or slightly maybe related or maybe not, but imagine that the version of the diag was regress tested on, let's say, versions 4 and below, and somebody bumps to a new version of an OS and it's running, say, memtester 5 something. Obviously, the diag may be able to run, right? But it may also encounter errors. A bit of an open discussion for the team is how do you handle at that point parsing errors from the output of that diag, because you may just get lucky and you get what you want, or you may stumble and find a parsing error at some point. And I don't know if that should become part of the developer guidance on how to handle these types of errors in the case where you're doing wrapping of instrumented, not even instrumented, but just executables, right?
So I'm familiar with how that is going on for memtester right now, but I would let Igor answer your question.
So you will be very lucky if you get lucky, because when you parse text with LexYak, it's very strict about the output. That is, if you have an extra symbol somewhere, this will be detected. It will throw a parsing error. So I would carefully say that if you don't have parsing errors, then probably you captured the output. But this is like, I'm doing this statement very carefully because I'm not 100% sure.
So that's not really a guarantee, Igor, if you think about it, because it's not really dependent on Lex and Yak. It's more dependent on the regexes that you wrote. So if they're overly inclusive, maybe, I don't know if this is the right word, then you might get false positives, which is kind of what Vincent is talking about. Permissive. Thank you. So I would actually say, and this is a question for you, Igor, is there some code right now, or are you planning on adding a version check for the actual memtester, which is supported?
Actual version check on memtester. I mean, there is already a version check. Maybe I didn't understand your question properly.
So what Vincent is asking is, what if the memtester, which is installed in the system by a different method, like apt, DNF, whatever, suddenly upgrades, and your diag layer, which is the parser and producing OCP output, still works with this new version, but it gives you subtly false data because the regexes were overly permissive. It doesn't actually fail, but it gives you slightly incorrect data.
Oh, I see. Well, currently there is a warning log. If the wrapper detects an unsupported memtester version, you get a warning. It doesn't fail. Adrian's suggestion was to add an option, an argument to the wrapper so that it can fail the run instead of just showing a warning.
Yeah, so this is what I was. Yeah, this is what I was asking, because I have a memory of the PR that we were discussing this in the PR, in that you can add the flag and say, okay, the memtester you have is completely incompatible. I haven't tested it, so I will just fail.
Yeah, we can do that, sure. If this is something we need, yeah.
Well, what do you think of that, Vincent?
I think it definitely deserves some thought and discussion, because anything's possible, right? So if you never validated that version of memtester, that means you cannot stand by it in your diag. So you're running in unknown territory, and at that point, the decision as to how you want to call the test status and the test result at the end is up in the air. So I could definitely see some parametrization here in order to say what behavior do we want in case we encounter an unsupported or unvalidated version of memtester. One could say, if it's unsupported, I want to skip, I want to fail, I want to I want to take a risk and still collect the data. I mean, memtester tend to be a pretty long running test. So when you're running these types of diagnostic, if you're running in uncharted territory, that could be a very big impact. In manufacturing, for example, you wouldn't want to venture there with an unsupported diagnostic. So I think from a tooling perspective, we just need to be able to support these different execution modes, and it should be parameterizable what to do if you have an unsupported underlying utility.
Okay, so Igor is already handling this, right? Adding a parameter to define this behavior. I would add to this though that the default value of that behavior should be to refuse to run if your mem tester dependency is incompatible, because that guarantees you correctness. If you let it run, maybe it throws a warning. Nobody's going to look at the warning, or people in general do not read warnings. So it's going to give you like incorrect data, and you wouldn't necessarily get a correct decision based on that data.
Sorry, go ahead, Igor.
No, I just said that this sounds reasonable.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the default behavior should be more on that conservative side. I would say that there's a lot of also test frameworks and test executives and environments where the dependency itself obviously is downloaded as part of the execution of the diagnostic, right? So in this case, I think the broader discussion in the case of memtester as well is what delineates reusing the expectation that it's installed already. We're reusing the system level utility, or that it's been installed independently of the diagnostic itself, which is maybe a different discussion altogether.
Right. Okay. So I've actually captured this in the agenda for today. Go ahead, Marcos.
All right. So I had a couple things. One of the ones is that I have to communicate a lot with some of the newer test engineers is the absence of failure does not mean pass. So just because we didn't encounter a parsing error doesn't mean that the diag ran successfully or we got all the data we needed. The other way I like to think of it is, here is the criteria I need to establish a path, and however you collect it, whatever you do in order to get this data and it's within the allowed range, then that's a path. So if we're able to not just to be able to specify some sort of parametrics or the criteria for a diag path, then it's not whether the path is basically implied based on I collected all the data that required, it was all within the allowed range, so thus it's a path. Which is different than we ran the thing and I didn't find anything bad, so it must have been good, right? So that's just one of the thoughts. The other one is, when it comes to the memtester, it feels like we're talking about an implementation for memtester and how we handle the version. And not a generic like apply against all, but it would probably inform the bigger thing. But as far as supported versions, I don't know if it would make sense for us to compile in a list of supported versions if every time there's a new version we have to go back to our wrapper code and add another additional version of that, another supported version or not.
So I agree with you, Marcos. That's why I was calling this fragile, because there is no guarantee from software developers that you have standard output stable, like in terms of text, right? So even if you have like a patch version update in terms of major, minor patch versioning somewhere, that isn't to say that your output hasn't changed, which will confuse the parser, the Lexer parser, right? So it comes as a necessity to encode specifically what version, stable version of the code that produces this output is validated to have worked with the parser. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree.
All right. Well, I don't have a good solution for this. Maybe we just need to like document the fact that this is one of the disadvantages of wrapping a tool in this parsing way. All right. You still have your hand up, Marcus. I don't know if you want to add something else.
No, sorry, I am unfamiliar with this.
All right. I think I got it. So other updates. I don't know if Hua, we haven't had that discussion yet, and I saw you sent an email with a proposal of the output. I don't know if you have any updates that you'd want to share right now.
No, I don't have update. That's just putting what we discussed last time together in the some sort of realization, so we can discuss on top of that and what we need to tweak. So everyone just put everyone on the same page. Yeah, that's the whole point. So
yeah, no worries. I think I don't know if you added that to the GitHub discussion, that JSON file. If you haven't,
no, this is just my own experimental thing that I put in, and yeah, just to play around. It's a very kind of crude way of generating these messages. Yeah.
All right. So what I would say is Satish is gone with some other work right now. So if it's okay with you, we could wait for Satish to come back and set up that call, and we can explore more your proposal.
Okay, sure. Yeah. If anyone has interest, take a look and see any obvious problem with it. Yeah, we can just discuss on the email thread.
Yeah, I'm kind of guessing. I don't remember right now off the top of my head, but I think next week Satish should be available.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. And I don't know, Arun, maybe you have some update on the OSFCI part, if you had time to look at that.
Yeah, so I would have usually put it on my notes. We have been busy with a few things related to the CI, so no Delta to report for this week. I will be in touch with you on DM.
All right, thanks for that.
And in fact, I apologize for being a bit late today as well, because I had a meeting that started very early in the morning, and it carried over.
No worries, no worries. Okay, I think for the updates we are done right now. I don't see anyone else on the call that I know is working on something. So since we're done with the agenda, if anyone wants to raise any other topics right now, we have like another 20 minutes. Otherwise, if everyone's happy with the current status, we can end early. Okay. So in that case, I think we can end earlier and give back 20 minutes. What I would say before we leave is please go to GitHub and look at the discussions tab on the core one. I think there's a pending discussion or two. And if you have like opinions, please comment there.
Yeah,
Yes, Vincent.
I mean, you're raising the GitHub discussion. I think in the last few days, Igor and George were having a discussion on the skip. I don't know if it's worthwhile to spend 5 to 10 minutes trying to get some alignment here, or do you guys want to keep it to the GitHub discussions?
I'm fine if we want to discuss this right now. The point of this is to have like more live discussion than the GitHub discussion tab. But if we have enough to like have this talk right now, then we should.
So I think there's the first question was like, how to adjust the skip message to make unit testing easier. Igor raised another point about like whether we should skip at all. I don't know if maybe we should spend this time, trying to answer that question.
Yeah, I appreciated your latest note, George. I do agree. There's 2 points here being brought up, and I think we should be clear about separating them. There's the use cases for skipping, and then there's which Igor is raising, and we can discuss how to augment sort of the spec to be very clear about the use cases where skip is needed. And then there's the point you're making about test run end not having an explicit field for the skip reason. So on the first one, I think it's not a question of whether skip is needed or not. I think it's a matter of maybe being more explicit in the documentation about the use cases for skip. So Igor, I see you have your hand up. Maybe the question is, when you read through the spec, are you finding that the use cases that explain why skip is a legitimate use case to differentiate between conformant and non-conformant diags, is that not sufficient? How do we make this actually pop? But please go ahead.
Maybe I should reread the spec then, because I was talking to other people on my team and asked them, like, why do we need this in the first place? And I couldn't hear a legitimate reason for skipping. And I heard some problems that we had with skipping, because sometimes we just ignore this. And my point is that skip adds uncertainty to the diags output, because all we are interested in is whether certain hardware passes the test or it fails the test. When it is skipped, what do you do with the skip? Is it a pass or is it a fail? It's uncertain, because in some cases it could be considered a pass. In some cases it could be considered a fail. And my point is, why don't we converge to these two statuses, pass or fail? Because this is what we usually do with tests, right? Like unit tests don't skip, they test the function and give you the answer, right? They don't create uncertainty. So that was my point.
So I'll add a bit more context to that. I think the reason why that skip status is there is a bit legacy in a way, because generally when you look at a test framework or whatever, you see pass, fail, and skip. So in that sense, I think that's a big reason why that got to be there. But on the other hand, the semantic of skip is supposed to be the data that you're not interested in, or some behavior that you're not interested in for this particular use case. So you can view it as being an artifact of the diag being too broad in a sense. So it can cover multiple use cases, and some of them do not apply, therefore you skip them. This is one valid way of viewing, but what you just said, Igor, is basically equivalent to this, because you could say, okay, I know exactly what I want to test and how, and I will decide as a user, maybe through some command line arguments or input to the diag, to say, okay, I'm interested in this test step and in this behavior and something else, right? So you intentionally remove all of those possible skips that would have been there. And in doing so, you say, okay, everything that I have specified as being part of my test right now can only be pass or fail. There is no skip in this semantic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is correct.
Okay, so I guess it's yeah, for me it's kind of a matter of interpretation, but I kind of understand the viewpoint of not wanting to put in extraneous data in the diag either. Go
Well,
ahead, Vincent.
I think, I mean, obviously, we all like binary outcomes. It's always sort of the most desirable clarity. You know, you have a diagnostic, you're just getting a binary output. But we have to remember the diagnostics are also run in the hardware development lifecycle. That can be in a lab, it can be in an environment during an NPI. Many times, way more than expected, hardware engineers will want to run diagnostics and have control of the failure mode to get conformance and to get a signal, I should say, rather than conformance. And skipping is actually a surprisingly common part of that development. So because something is not ready, they are still looking at getting their pass at the end for the overall run of the diagnostic while skipping some parts of that. And I understand the reasoning going into the test executive, but having control of that behavior in the diagnostic is I think is a legitimate use case. I do hope we don't use it often, that, you know, skip is not the prevalent, you get 99 tests skipped and 1 test to pass. Hopefully that's never the case, but I can absolutely see that having support for skip is actually a mature, shows a maturity in the diagnostic reasoning, and I think it would be good to keep. I see a few hands, but I would like to move to George's point after that to understand, you know, to discuss the skip reason. Marcos, to you first.
So I feel like the decision of skipping or not skipping needs to be at a higher level, not within the diag itself. And so that idea that, hey, we're in early test development and we're not sure what works or what doesn't, there's no way that knowledge should be done inside the diag in my eyes. That needs to be at the higher level of, hey, all of this stuff is failing, so we're gonna at a higher level decide that we can skip these tests and do the exception as a mandated directive thing, as opposed to just, well, if it doesn't support something, just return a skip and move on. Because that's, I think, I don't know if it was Igor's point, but like the uncertainty there, and that's been an endless cause of concern that I've encountered in some of the diagnostics that we've had to execute over the years.
Adrian, do you mind if I jump in real quick on this one?
Go ahead. I have exactly what he was talking about, but go ahead.
Because I do want to respond. I completely agree. First of all, let me not get this wrong, Marcos. I do think the decision to skip has to come from sort of above the diagnostic. But just like the discussion we had on MemTester, you should be able to tell your diagnostic what to do in case of an ambiguous encounter, whether it's unknown hardware, whether it's a particular, you know, corner condition that may be encountered, and you may want to tell it that in those cases I want to skip this part rather than fail it. And this again goes back to the signal that the test executor, you know, person rather than the test executive is necessarily going to make. So I agree with you, but I look at it from a tooling perspective. The capability of the diagnostic to support skip as a test outcome should remain supported, even though not often used, but it should be supported. That's my point. So I agree, but with a caveat.
So for completeness sake, what I was saying earlier with like command line arguments and the decision whether to skip or not, this kind of identifies with what Marcos said as well, and the thing that you agree with, Vincent. So technically, I would say all of the steps are mandatory, and something else higher up than the diag through some sort of input to the diag says whether some steps are okay to be skipped, right? And if you think about it, this kind of matches with existing logic in other places as well. So if you run like unit tests, you say, okay, I want to skip these particular unit tests because of the reason. So given this, I would actually say that it goes into the skip reason a bit as well. Because if you say as input to your diag, I want to skip some particular step because hardware may not be available, or because the step doesn't apply to what I'm doing right now, or because it's not ready, then don't you already have the skip reason?
Yeah, that's a valid point. You're saying the skip reason is actually a directive to skip. So you're actually declaring but I think that's one path to skipping. I think the path George was outlining was a discovery that based on some other configuration causes a test or a test step, or in this case, he was referring to the test run as, hey, we're going to actually skip this entirely. So I think there's at least those two paths, right? There's one where it is declarative and the other one that is actually discovered.
Well, I mean, to be honest, my question is a bit superficial, because you would still want to document that reason in the output, even if it was just input. So we still need to talk about how you actually present the reason. Go ahead, Igor.
Yeah, so if we have this unexpected discovery about the underlying hardware, shouldn't this be a fail? Because this is something we did not expect to see, then we should draw the user's attention to this situation.
Well, this depends. This is exactly what we're talking about, right? If you tell the diag that this is acceptable, then it's going to be a skip. If you didn't say anything, then it's a failure.
Okay. Why don't we say it's a pass if this is acceptable? So why do we need to say it's a skip? Because technically, diag tells us if the situation is expected or unexpected, right?
Well, it kind of depends on how you govern optionality here. Like it would be on the diag implementation to say if, okay, my diag can actually run and produce useful data by skipping this particular aspect, or if it's like completely dead in the water without that hardware.
And I think there's an important difference, a semantic difference between pass and skip. I mean, pass tells me that something was done and this thing was actually validated, versus skip was like nothing was done.
Yeah. Listen.
Yeah, no, George just captured it, and there's a lot of tooling, for example, that we have. I'm sure everybody has that as well. That will do a log analysis, and if you're running, say, memtester, since we were discussing about it, and you expect it to run for 4+ hours, and your log analysis finds that it was a pass, but it ran for like 2 seconds, that's gonna, you need a qualifier to say why that happened. I'm kind of oversimplifying here to just outline the many examples where you can have a legitimate reason where you want to qualify a skip. But we did have that. I mean, Igor, I do think if you haven't looked at the definition for skip, because I remember we had discussion around this, and exactly that point, pass fail, as that's kind of really where we wanted to land. But skip was a hard one to rule out, and so there was language put in the spec that outlined why would we want to keep a skip. And so please look at it and let's make it better. If it doesn't pop out, I think it deserves a double click.
Go ahead, Marcos.
Yes. Okay. Good. The difference between skipped and passed and failed, etc., I think is important because, for example, I could do something where I evaluate memtester and say run the diag, etc., and we could have something inside that says if the temperature is at a certain range, let's skip this test and move on, right? And that's a directive. We say, hey, if whatever parameter, skip this thing. So it's different than a fail and it's different than a pass, and it can be an educated decision, right? So that's the kind of use case where I see a pass, fail, and different.
So I've captured in the meeting notes some aspects that I think are relevant here to be added, or to check if they exist in the spec text. One is the DIAC should not decide by itself to skip tests, only as a result of user input. And the other one is highlight the semantic difference between skip and pass, what you just said, Marcus, and other people. All right, so I guess we get back to the original topic, which is where do we actually put the skip reason? And we have 3 minutes for that.
Yeah, so I did. So I found yesterday that that discussion in my personal email that didn't get highlighted. So I'm behind on it. But one of the topics seemed to be, can we not send a start, like some of the messages, the start message, I think, so start step or start test or something. And I felt that we should always be sending the right sequence of messages. Sending an end without having a send to start seemed incorrect, but I think modifying the end with with a reason seems somewhat reasonable, of being able to provide some error or some end test, the error or skipped or success or whatever, and then having some sort of reason, a description or something seems reasonable.
And I think the first thing to understand, and this is, I've not written enough DIACs to know, so I'm looking for guidance here. I think, George, you made a point that if you skip, you're relying on other artifacts to piece that together, which adds some complexity and uncertainty. The first question maybe I have is, what other artifact could become the de facto sort of standard for getting, would it be a log? I mean, we wouldn't probably want to get into the full test step run where we would be getting that. You're actually saying you may want to get a test run, start, test run, end immediately with the reason without the test step, where we could get an actual artifact. So actually, my first question is, what could be the right artifact to, without adding a skip reason, where we would find the skip reason?
I mean, we currently use the log info. I just really don't like that solution because, I mean, anybody can insert logs, and you might, every implementation is different. They might check for the 5th log in the sequence, and then if you add another log before that, it breaks the test. It doesn't seem robust. I mean, we could do like a dedicated message that says, hey, this was skipped. I don't know if this really rises to that level where we need to introduce a new artifact for it. So I think the minimally invasive change would just be to add a new field on the test front end. It's kind of where I'm at.
So to your point, George, adding a different artifact can be in 2 places, in 2 positions. One, it could replace that log and formalize the fact that this is the reason why it was skipped. So you look for this specific message rather than guessing which of the logs is actually relevant for the skip. The second position is in the test step end itself, whether as a field or whether as a different artifact, which is a different enum variant with the test step end. I'll add this to the GitHub discussion, this opinion, and we can continue there. Just wanted to mention that. Go ahead, Vincent.
I know we're out of time, but I think what you're saying is where I was headed as well. Should we always have a test step be what is skipped as opposed to, the test run?
Yeah, yeah, because
that actually is at the heart of some of that conversation here.
Yeah, because you may still do stuff in that test step that you later decide within the context of to skip the rest of the logic and say, I have skipped this, but there's some logging or some other stuff happening in the step, even if it did not produce useful data.
And then the question is, would the diagnosis at all play apart in potentially.
So yeah, that's what I was saying the last time. Maybe diagnosis is the right place to put this, and this is like the replacement position for the log that George is saying they're using. Like you say, diagnosis, this step was skipped because of.
What do you think about that, George? If we still have you.
I think George is already gone. Okay, so we're 1 minute over. I would say we continue this discussion next time. Please have a look at the GitHub discussions and write anything you might think of there. And thank you for joining today, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye.